Hello, welcome. My name is James Skeet. I'm with the Navajo Nation, Jadlashchid and Kiani Bashashchin. This is my wife, Joyce.
Been married for 30 years, come from back east, Pennsylvania, so I've been out here, ever since about late 1980s.
Thanks for joining us. In this pod series, the 6 Sacred Stones of Regenerative Farming, one of the things that we continue to emphasize is how important the soil is to the microbiome in our gut as well as in the soil itself. There should be a real purpose of reciprocity, but somewhere along the way, as we experience a lot of industrialization and modernization, we've lost that connection between nature's patterns and mimicking Mother Nature. Nature is really our solution to the problems that we face today. So the thing that we are experiencing all across the globe is this sense of urgency to reverse the tide. And then what we're not seeing is solutions to a lot of the questions that people have. I hate to say this, but I want to say it with humility. The way we're farming, the way we're doing conventional agriculture is not the answer. The answer lies within indigenous communities that have 40,000 years of mimicking Mother Nature and then fitting into the cycles and patterns of the earth, so to speak. But what's happened in 150 years is really the demise and destruction of our environment, extinctions, the use of pesticides, fungicides, herbicides. And this has kind of been the addiction that many conventional farmers are addicted to. And we're going to talk a little bit about indigenous perspectives and intelligence that will help you understand that nature is really displaying itself right in front of us. But to come in and conquer it and to put it under our feet and to control the environment with artificial synthetic ingredients is not the way out. So we are talking about how do we mimic nature with animals like sheep, chickens, and cows. We are in a very brittle environment where we're at. So anything that we do will overbalance or will create imbalance, so to speak, in our lands. And that's what's happening with how we've treated nature as something of a commodity. And what we need to do is really look at it from a sacred manner. And this sacred manner is really approaching things that are in natural cycles, fractals. In nature, there really is no straight line. There's curvatures and things that we need to understand. And these fractals are things that indigenous people have applied in many different fashions. And we'll give you examples as we go along of what we mean by that. To put it simply and most directly, we're in big trouble. We are disrupted by nature, so to speak. Nature is going to take over again eventually. It's really not dependent on human beings. But human beings have caused a lot of the destructions and negativity across the globe. And as a result, a lot of lands that used to be lush and had natural patterns have been disrupted and has caused the desertification. There's a debate going on about carbon sequestration and carbon counts and all that, banking carbon. All that is a very Western white man's perspective. What we need to be looking at is not just the fossil fuels, but how a lot of our lands have moved into brittle, harsh, desertified lands, which is creating this hydrodome or thermal dome. And what happens when the moisture hits it, the hydrogen molecules, it just moves around. And you get this haze of dirt and particles that are in the air, which doesn't attract the hydrogen particles. In fact, it has a different charge, so it repels. So what do we do then? How do we look at nature? And nature has its own transpiration, the bacteria that floats up into the atmosphere. And these bacteria is created from the microbial sponge or the compost or microbes in the soil. And these charges are very attractive to the hydrogen particles. So what happens is when these particles, if the soil is right and the plant, you take it up, and then they release not just the hydrogen moisture, but when they release these bacteria into the atmosphere, it creates this cycle called the biotic pump, which attracts a lot of hydrogen particles. And then the byproduct of that is rain that's created as heavy and it drops into droplets. We're just now beginning to understand the impact, not just with fossil fuels, but the desertified land that's created a lot of this dome over the top of us. So we have these, what we call half water cycles. Water does come in a lot of these desertified lands, but what happens is they come in torrents. It used to be 100-year floods. Now it's become 50, 10, now it's 5. So a lot of these floods creates the compaction on the soil. The water just runs off because there is no sponge or soil or plants to slow the water down. So the things that we are talking about on Spirit Farm is really how do we keep water on the top surface? How do we slow it down? How do we keep it on the land itself so that you can recreate a full water cycle? All across this country, instead of putting monies into swales and slowing the water down, we're putting monies into a lot of firefighting, and it seems to be very heroic. But in a sense, we're not looking at the full water cycle. So we need to tie back into indigenous perspectives. When we say indigenous perspective, what we're looking at is decolonizing ourselves from the science, the empiricism that's been presented to us to create cities and to control nature and to introduce conventional farming, instead of looking at the marginalized perspective that indigenous people have, which is to look at the different dimensions of intelligence. How do we mimic nature with animals, adjusting ourselves to the patterns of nature's solutions? And that's kind of the concept that we'd like to tackle. I don't want to just talk in theory, because I know that a lot of this seems to be theoretical in nature. But on our farm, we're trying to add a lot of practicality to the theory itself. And we're testing things. We're not only using science, reductionist thinking, but we're also using the systems model, nature's patterns, and how do we tie into. What we're doing here on Spirit Farm is going back to some of the basic, looking at the soil and how that really is our livestock, so to speak, growing the microbes, really growing the balance within the soil, and then amending our lands that is compacted and lacking in a lot of things, which moves eventually into desertification. Joyce has got some examples about some of the stories that we have on the farm itself in regards to insects, in regards to animals.
Yeah, when it comes to nature's patterns, I'll just give you one example. It's amazing the solutions we do find in nature. On our farm, we use compost to amend the chlorine and salts and harsh minerals in water so that we can water our garden without all that harshness. And in the compost itself, there's 2 products called humic acid and fulvic acid. And I know when you think of acid, it's like, ew, but these acids are found naturally in really healthy soils and compost. And so we make a compost extract and we get it pumped up through a dosing pump and into our drip lines into our garden. And it's amazing how it amends the chlorine and the minerals and harshness, salts and harshness of the water. And that is something that we as humans have made that is detrimental to the earth. And yet nature has provided a solution for us. And so when we just really take some time and sit back and look at nature, observe nature, and really begin to give nature the respect and realize the intelligence of nature, we can find a tremendous amount of solutions.
So our first stones that we presented was water sacred, Father Sky, the biotic pump. And then we moved down into the second stone, which was holding soil sacred, Mother Earth. So those 2 dimensions are archetypes within indigenous cosmology. And then we go down deeper into reconnecting with the microbes, establishing kinship, understanding that they're, in a sense, our livestock. If we don't have those microbes working in our soil, we're really creating something that's artificial or something that is not growing. And then honoring the microbes. How do we honor them? Because indigenous people, as they walk in a sacred manner, often are looking at ways to honor, because it's the creator that creates a lot of these living organisms, and those that we think are not living, but to the creator. He developed this as a way to have this cycle going. And as indigenous people, we try to not only mimic, but how do we tap into this sense of worldview? And then how do we use polyculture, maximizing diversity within our soil? And what we do is we move away from monocropping into polycultural cropping, which I think is a result of the impact, even on a higher hyphae level, the plants up into the four-legged, into the two-legged. The human beings have become very monoculture. And then, of course, how do we mimic nature? How do we use animals to readjust ourselves into the pattern of the natural solutions, which moves back into what we started out with in this secular fashion. Water is sacred, Father Sky, and then it goes into the cycle of seasons.
Part of using nature too and looking at the role that animals take place, we want to also include the pollinators and insects in this. And one thing we've found in our garden is when we diversify our plants, we have less pests, less aphids, less potato beetles, less pests that really are hard on our plants. When we diversified our garden with potatoes, we just had them scattered around. We did not put them in a row. We had 80% less potato beetles. And I think sometimes we look at a lot of insects and we see them as bad. And I want to give you two examples. One is a grub. Every time we see a grub, most of us, we think, oh, it eats roots, let's kill it. But only one grub or a few grubs of the many will do that. The others don't do that. And yet we're killing all the grubs. And the other thing that people get really afraid of is a nematode. There's 4 species of nematodes. Only one is a bad nematode, and that one's found in bad soil. That one will eat roots. But the other 3 are very beneficial. And if we go to kill nematodes, now we're killing the beneficial ones also. So the insect, they each have their little niche. Another thing we like to do with pollinators is one of the first things many people want to do to increase pollination, they'll bring honeybees in. Honeybees in most areas comes from the outside. It's not a local insect. So when you bring in a big hive like a honeybee, and especially if you're in a fragile environment, that honeybee is going to push out your local pollinators. There are many plants that will not be pollinated by a honeybee. And one of those is a squash. In the morning, the blossoms open, but the honeybee isn't out yet to go around and do its pollination. There's other plants where there's certain specific insects that do that pollination, and only that insect or few insects. Honeybees have no role in that place. So how do we incorporate all of the insects? How do you look at nature to provide those solutions for pollination?
So when Joyce says the honeybee, she's actually talking about the European bees. The native bees, 70% live in the ground, not in hives. So when you look at those pollinators, you have to really look at what are indigenous insects. We are now in what they call Insectgeddon, which is the killing of a lot of insects. We now are approaching 70% of our insects are gone because of all the insecticides and all the things that we've been spraying our fields with to get rid of them. So this is kind of reactionary perspective. It's a type of observation that's very existential. And science has been part of this whole demise of nature, disrupting nature in a sense that has caused a lot of the problems that we're seeing in agriculture and conventional farming. If we look at different hyphae, different layers, how we treat our chickens, they've been around for such a long time. In fact, there are modern dinosaurs. When we have little baby chicks, what we try to do is not have a hatch that is square. We try to round things off because every year what we would see is a couple chickens dying in the corner, suffocating. So we started rounding off our little hatch so that there would be no corner to die in. And then we also looked at tree range chicken. Instead of free range, we moved into tree range because that's their natural habitat as chickens. So what we're doing on our farm is really trying to indigenize every levels and every perspective, looking at how plants in their hyphae function and how the microbes, as you go down into the layers, how we're reimagining the context in which our environment used to be.
Another thing that I've been really learning is how to really learn from the animals and really acknowledging that they have emotions, they have intelligence, and more so, they understand their own environment, their needs, what they need to eat. The places they need to walk, not walk. They understand that more than we as humans do, and yet we want to try to manage them sometimes. I remember we had a sheep just had a baby, and the mom rejected it. And so I was there right when it was born, actually came upon it. And so I became that sheep's mother, and I bottle fed it, and we raised that sheep. And I remember a few times right after it was born, I tried to put it in the pen with its mom. And after the third time, I said to myself, I want to try one more time. And I put it in the pen and I watched it. And this little baby walked to the corner, stuck its head in the corner, head down, and its ears were drooping. It was so dejected. It did not want to be there. And my heart sank and it hurt. And I went in there and I pulled that baby out and I took him outside. And the minute I got her outside, she started dancing and jumping around, so happy. And I've never seen intense emotion from an animal like that just touched me so deeply. And I think so often we really do not acknowledge a lot of those emotions of the animals. And a lot of it's because we do not observe it and because we think that we know better.
And knowing this is really the indigenous regenerative intelligence. Indigenous meaning that we're using a lot of local materials, using local intelligence. Animal have their intelligence. As Joyce mentioned a little bit about the sheep, we've been learning a lot because our Dene culture, the Navajo culture, is so closely connected to sheep. We became so powerful across the West that we were called the lords of the land. People feared us. And the reason why is because we had the sheep economy functioning at full robust across this country. And the Navajos were eating omega-3s from the sheep meat. And in that creativity and also the using the soil and using the plants to create this robust culture. Creating this robust culture meant that it was a tremendous, powerful nation that were using a lot of the different seasons. They were trans-nomadic in a sense that they were using perennial plants across the Southwest. They became medicine people because they understood at different areas and different locations that nature produced a lot of these plants that were way beyond the nutrient level of annual crops that we eat now, beans, corns, and squash.
I remember another time where we took our cows that had been penned up for a while and we took them out to pasture. And in about 5 months, our cow went lame. And we realized that what was happening was because she had been penned up, she did not know how to eat. She did not know where to get the nutrients out on the land. And so we brought her back in, gave her the minerals, and just really brought her back to health and put her out again. And after that second time, she began to understand how to eat as she learned from the other animals. And now as she's having babies, she's teaching their babies how to eat. Another thing we're moving into is foraging, a diversity of forage crops, especially brassicas, Sudan, sorghum grasses, some legumes, radishes, and things like that, that we can plant to build up more forage for the animals to go out and to eat. Sometimes there's a lot of negativity from conventional farms because they're so used to monocropping that when they test a single crop, they see all this excess minerals or things in there that's not good for the animal. But when you diversify, now the animal can get a diversity, a smorgasbord, the buffet of what's out there instead of just one single type of feed or 2 or 3. Now it's got 15, 16, 18 types of foods and minerals that they can get.
This sheep intelligence that Joyce is talking about is very, very interesting. In our observation in just the last couple of years since we've been looking at Churro sheep and some other breeds on our land, the first 2 weeks that we sent them out from the pens over winter, there's a little bit of domestication that they have to sort of dismount from. And then what kicks in is their own intelligence. And you'll see sheep by the end of the season around August and September, like Joyce said, picking out what they want to eat and what's medication to them. And they basically medicate themselves. So what you have in these meats, when we butcher them at the end of the season or whenever we're in need of meat, we have tested some of our meats through fermentation as well as grazing, foraging them on our land. What we find is high levels of omega-3s that is very beneficial to help our indigenous people dismount from diabetes, hypertension, inflammation, and it rebuilds a lot of the inner lining of the gut, which we haven't really talked about. But we're moving into that nutrient density, how to heal ourselves through animals, how to heal ourselves through working with the soil, and then the plant hyphae taking it up, and how we can heal from that. So we're moving in fast momentum each year into what we call food as medicine that comes out of indigenous mindsets. We wanted to end these stones with, there's a lot more that we're learning and we're drilling down on, and we're getting a better understanding, a foothold on more and more people coming on board and learning from some of the workshops that we have. We have a lot of young people that are now entering into what I call an elder culture, a culture that they themselves know that it's up to them to answer some of these questions that in my generation, I think has really forfeited their role on impacting the environment. They're too busy fighting over politics, are too busy fighting over their own egos or capitalizing and making themselves rich at the sake of a lot of our communities. And so when we talk about community, we're talking about the flip side. What's the flip side of community is commodity. We've commoditized foods, we've commoditized land, we've commoditized the water system to the point where we are actually trying to tell ourselves that we are feeding the world. No, I think the main purpose of the work that we're doing should be feeding our community. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think it impacts this regenerative economy, a nurturing economy that I see that's coming out of this pandemic. People have been disrupted. The supply chain has been disrupted. The view of how health has really impacted our communities because of the nutrient density. Now the larger community, the dominant culture itself, is falling victim to plants and animals that are contaminated, and now we're ingesting them. So in a sense, I think these are some important questions that we need to ask ourselves. Is the U.S. pays the least amount in grocery bills than any other country. There's a lot of countries that are pushing back, like Mexico is not using a lot of the Roundup anymore, which is the trademark name for glyphosate. And then other countries don't allow wheat that has been sprayed with that, because that's really the purpose of spraying, is to dry them out. And there's some things that conventional farming is doing that is really not in the context of health. Like, for example, they're injecting a lot of antibiotics in feedlots. Feedlots itself is as bad as it is because they're all crunched into these little small pens. But the reason why they're injecting antibiotics is so that they will have a heavier weight scale when they sell them off. So all these things, I think, are coming into fruition. All Americans and global folks are starting to ask a lot of questions. What am I ingesting? Is the food I'm ingesting healthy? Is my flavoring that's coming out of different companies keeping us from feeling full? All these things are synthetic, artificial. What will it take for us to be disrupted by nature? What will it take for us to come back into this cycle of understanding that nature is top dog, not us? And we'd like to end with this, understanding that it all flows back into water, soil, honoring the microbes, using the animals in the right capacity, what's their nature. So this indigenous regenerative intelligence is a key mission for what we do here on Spirit Farm. So I hope you enjoyed these stones, and if you have any other questions or wanting more information, we do have a website. It's either spiritfarmnm.org or covenantpathways.org. Thank you very much.